Welcome to the first Ireland Chapter webinar here on the 31st of March. I'm just going to pause a few moments, let a few more people join us, and then we will get going and we'll kick off. David, if you want to say hello there, I think David's on the call with me as well at the moment.
Hello everybody. I hope you're looking forward to risk identification today. So hopefully we have a few new kind of types and techniques that you haven't seen before, keep you interested.
So what we have here at the moment, guys, is you see, hopefully you can see my screen. If any of you are able to maybe open up a separate screen on your computer, or maybe you can use your mobile, we're going to also trial menti.com. So if you can open up a browser and go to www.menti.com and use the code that you see there, we're going to also try and have a little poll as we go through the session to do some engagement and some interaction. You'll notice that you will be able to raise your hand here and ask a question as well, but we are going to trial this and see if we can have the questions asked through menti.com. So all you have to do there is menti.com, and then the code is 673499. Okay, so I will kick off without further ado. So again, welcome. At the moment, we have 43 people on the line with us.
Great.
So at the moment we have 43 people on, 46 actually on the line with us. So we are going to kick off. So again, welcome everybody to Risk Identification. This is Katrina Collins speaking, and I think most of you will have received an email from me by now. I'm the voluntary director of events for PMI Ireland, and as you may all be aware, anyone who's a previous member, we normally would have face-to-face chapter events, but in the current times, we have tried to move to webinar. So this is one of the first. We did have a webinar last week where the UK chapter kindly hosted us on their invitation. So this time we're going solo. As I said earlier there, if you have the ability to open up a separate browser or maybe use your mobile phone, if you go to www.menti.com and use the code there, we will have just a small handful of questions that we're going to go through during David's presentation, just to get a little bit of interaction going as well. So most of you probably received the invitation by now, so we're going to focus here on risk identification. So in this webinar, David O'Brien will walk through a number of familiar and not so familiar tools and techniques that the project manager can use to identify risks on a project. I found this quite useful myself because there were certainly a couple of techniques here that I haven't come across, and some that I've come across but I haven't used. So David's going to provide some practical examples on how to avoid the pitfalls of poor risk management and identify how certain tools can be useful in different situations. So before I hand over to David, we'll come back to me at the end of this. You will receive one technical PDU for attending this webinar, and we will auto-register you for that once you've attended. So we'll take a note of that towards the end. We will also pop up a couple of screens at the end on links to other webinars that you might find interesting and that you can join in the coming weeks. So David, I am going to hand over to you and I'll let you to do some of your introductions there.
Okay, how you doing? So I'm a project manager. I've been a project manager for a long time at this point. I've managed large scale and small scale projects, and one of my key interests in project management is risk management, and effectively I see it as a superpower that I can bring to project management, because I walk into a room having definitely prepared beforehand, but I walk into a room and I can see or figure out what risks might actually happen on the project beforehand, and so that then gives me some sort of an insight as to what's actually happening. So I think the slides have been handed back. I think Katrina, we can see your slides at the moment. You're having a look at.
Yeah, I'm going to again, just asking everyone to give me their patience while we give this a go and we see if we can present. So actually, some of you are already getting a hang of this, so this is fantastic. The First slide was just to ask everyone where you're joining from today. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot of people from Dublin, but very happy to report. We also have somebody internationally from the EU, from Welcome Germany. We also have people from Letterkenny to Meath. I'm hoping that you can all see that screen as well. So that's just giving you a taster of the wider audience that we can reach essentially when we're doing this remotely. So that's really good to see. Just in terms of what type of organization you guys on the line are representing at the moment, maybe if we can just see, just out of interest, where we're coming from here. We did give a couple of choices, so hopefully we've gathered a lot. Wow, we've got a lot here from telecoms, but we've got 12 people who've answered us there at the moment. So this is giving us a nice taster of what type of members we have here in the Ireland chapter of the PMI. So we're seeing a good spread. We're actually still seeing telecoms being a larger chunk, which is interesting, with over 33 responses at this stage. So it's quite informative. It would be interesting to know what the 18% are, but we can probably open that up to the questions at the end, and people can give me their feedback as well if there's any organization type that I've left out that I should have included, because at 20% that's quite a high number. So I must have missed out on something there. Okay. So just one last question before I hand you back to David, and we'll have a few more questions coming up. And this is just a fun one to get you back into the project management mood. In your opinion, what's the most important when you're running a project? Would it be the budget? Is it the schedule? Is it the quality? Or hey, it might even be having fun. Maybe some of you guys get to have some fun on your day-to-day in your project management. It's definitely not working out as a good number at the moment. I think getting results, which would be the one that I would pick as well, is definitely getting high up there on the results for sure. I think we'll definitely have to run a webinar in the future on focus ourselves on having some fun while we're running our projects and managing them, because it's good to see that we've got a lot of focus on the triple constraints: the budget, the time, and the quality. But really, we've got a really high majority here looking and focused on getting our results, which is fantastic. Okay, guys, so I am now going to hand you back to David, and we will pop back to Menti a little bit later, and we'll have a couple of questions for you on your input onto risk identification as we go through it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, that was very interesting to see, and so I look to kind of gauge some of the slides or the information in it based on the industries that we're in. But before I do, I just want to start on one specific part on this, which is what is risk. And risk is the definition of risk is probability multiplied by impact. I see a lot of business stakeholders come back to me and say, oh, well, that's not really a risk. But it actually probably is a risk. It's just that the probability of it happening is very small, but the impact of it might be huge. And that's why the risk register in itself is actually so important. So, you know, it's just worth bearing in mind, almost everything is a risk. It's either a risk or an opportunity, but it's going to be a risk, but it's based on the kind of probability that it will happen and the impact that it would have if it does happen. Okay, so these jokes are a bit silly. They're kind of bright and attentive, but this one kept in from an old slide. This is a wrapper called Common. And I just want to ask one question before we properly begin, which is, what types of risks do you consider to be the most common in projects? And so this is just to see if it matches up with where I have it as well. So I have a couple that I've researched on the next slide. And this could be interesting for you just to see if which ones you also feel are a part.
So this one will involve a little bit of typing, so hopefully you guys can see my screen again, and if you can just pop your answers in and we'll see some of them come up here. Resourcing, actually, yeah, very interesting. Certainly in some projects I've run, resourcing has always been a top issue for sure. Requirements.
And I like the unknown unknowns. and so we should keep contingency in the project just specifically for them.
We do have resources. It's interesting to see the commonalities from a group of project managers, the same things coming through. You'll obviously let us know, David, next when we pass back to you whether this is gelling with your own survey.
Yeah,
so let's have a little bit of fun on the comments as well, get the feedback in there. No contingency, very interesting, very interesting. So I think just as a sort of a look back through them, and definitely requirements is coming up quite a lot, quite an interesting one, and scope creep or scope not being clear, etc., which I think links to our requirements again. I shall leave it there and I will hand it back to you again, David.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, you will be happy to know that a lot of those are going to come up in this next screen. And what I want to make it clear is that what we're talking about today is risk identification. So it's to actually find those risks so that then we can capture them and then we can mitigate them afterwards. So another session would be the mitigation of those risks or dealing with the risks as we've actually found them. So that's not for today's session, but today's one is actually finding them and finding them quickly, easily, and in advance. So there's a number of surveys on this, and from one done in 2004, they identified 745 different types, and they mainly come in the area of process, or it can be divided in the area of process at 56%, and people at 44%. So this is a cheat slide. This is just in case you fall asleep for the rest of the presentation. This slide and the details on it are not going to show you how to find the risks or how to identify them, but this is going to find or tell you the ones that you will identify or the categories and types of the risks that you're going to identify. And this is very useful, and it's very useful at the start of this project, or sorry, at the start of this webinar, to run through this, because when you walk into a discovery phase, when you walk into a room where a project is starting or where we're talking about a new feature or piece of functionality, these are the types of risks that are going to cause you problems. And so this is where you have your radar or your ears open, just trying to listen out for specifically around these areas. So let's go into it. One of them is around the lack of management commitment and support. So I test this one regularly because what I do is I make sure that I have weekly status reports, weekly status meetings after I send the weekly status report. And I have ad hoc meetings with my clients as well. And I gauge their interaction or their attendance and interaction on those sessions to see that they are engaged and to keep them engaged, because that's a mitigation strategy as well. You want to keep them interested. When that starts to wane, this could be a problem for you, and then you have to step into a mitigation mode. So here's the one that came up quite a lot there. Misunderstanding of the requirements. This comes up again later on, but we'll get into that. But I would say an awful lot of risks on a project are due to this. So again, go into the discovery phases, go into the requirements analysis, go into the initial meetings, know that you're going to have this problem and look out for it immediately. And take a number of steps that you can do, which we'll get into, as to how to mitigate some of them. But definitely capture them along the way. And this is why it's so important that a project, or as a project manager, that a project isn't thrown to you after all of these phases have gone through and you're basically getting a completed project plan with a timeline already built into it and a collection of people. So you need to get involved early on so you can try and capture this. Next one is lack of user involvement. So this isn't the management involvement, this is the end user involvement into the requirements themselves, so that the people who have come up with the requirements are the people who use the system and not people in ivory towers. So watch out for these. Again, the mitigation steps around this are to bring those people in, see that at those initial meetings that those people are not, those business users are not involved, and go and bring them in. Changes to requirements. So very closely linked to the requirements, the misunderstanding of requirements themselves, but this is where the requirements change early on. And this was one of the big issues with Waterfall, where we would have a whole pile of these requirements changes at the end of the project. To mitigate these, we look for MVPs, we look for prototypes, and we look for fast deployments so that the end users who are going to see this and the business managers can basically get around or can see this, feed into it, and mitigate any risks early on. Next one is failure to gain user commitment, not the management commitment. I've seen projects fail where the end users revolted against the fact that they were getting this new system. Look for it. It is an absolute project killer. So you need to look for it early. You need to test it. And one of the ways to test this is to bring those users on board the project very early on and get their buy-in and get them to be a champion and utilize them as a champion for the project so that it gets accepted amongst all of their peers. Then the second last one is the failure to manage end user expectation. So that what we don't want, again, a waterfall issue, but that what was delivered is not exactly what was promised. And so they weren't expecting exactly what it would look like. And so early user involvement, early prototypes, MVPs will mitigate that issue. And I could be biased here, but a lack of effective project management methodology or using the right methodology at the wrong time can actually cause problems. And so you need to recognize that. Are you doing fragile? Are you working in a waterfall project in an agile fashion? They can marry up, but you just have to be very conscious. Okay, so that's the cheat slide. That's basically what types of risks you're going to find. This is the categorization based on a number of studies. But these are the risks that you're going to find, the common ones. Next, what we're going to go into is each of the slides, we're going to show how you can find these and how you can identify them. Bear with me for the first slide. It's probably the longest in terms of these and a bit the most boring, but there's details behind it and it ties into the rest of the presentation. So one of the many ways that you can actually try and identify risk on a project is to give a questionnaire or to structure or create a questionnaire at the start of a project. This questionnaire doesn't have to be given to anybody. It can actually be just for yourself. And it's a very good and useful exercise to actually go through this so that you can identify it. Ties in nicely with any further conversations that you're going to have. So this questionnaire that I have here in front of me is based on Boehm's top 10 risks. So this is a study of all of the risks in the projects in the world, not just software projects, that manifest themselves. It's an international study and it this kind of looks or asks for all of these questions. And we have a couple of mitigation strategies against them. So the first one is personnel shortfalls. So this is, again, at the start of a project, you want to make sure that you have the right people with the right skills on your project within the project time frame. And if you don't have those, which often happens because they're just a group of or a collection of people might be thrown together at the start of a project, then team building exercises can help to mitigate this, and also cross training. So if you identify in your project that there's pieces of functionality that one or two or most of the project team won't be able to do, then train them in early. Make sure that they have that skill set so that when the project really gets going and when the deadlines start to hit, that you have a whole team that you can call upon. The next one came up in the first slides. It's the unrealistic schedules and budgets. So this is, in this instance, what you want to do is, before even a deadline is imposed on you, you want to make sure that the team who estimated the work to fit into the deadline has been estimated by the team who will be undertaking the work. So there's a number of reasons why you want to do that. One of them is to do with intrinsic motivation and a sense of ownership. But also you want to find, at this point, you want to find all of the dependencies between the different tasks and make sure that they're accounted for so that you can figure out the critical path so that you won't be missing the mark. Again, go in with your eyes open early and make sure that if you do have risks around this area, that you mitigate them early on rather than late. Again, let it be your superpower and don't let it be surprising. So here, another way to do this or to mitigate the problem is around incremental development and requirement scrubbing, just to make sure that everything's okay. Next is developing the wrong functions and properties. So this is where your requirements for the system may not be clear, understandable, and stable. So to recognize that, you want to kind of ask, on this project, with this team, with this company, has there been a history of misunderstanding or miscommunication between the developers or between the teams to make sure that you have the functions correctly defined? If you have, then you definitely have to mitigate that. So you can have a look at the organizational analysis. Another nice way of doing this is to have test-driven development, or implement some level or any level of test-driven development that you can do on a software project, just to see that what can actually be delivered is correct before it's ever even developed. So even getting people to write early user manuals could be good, because it teases out some of the problems before they ever get introduced into the project. Next is developing the wrong user interfaces. A Microsoft interface looks different to an Apple interface, and so you probably have your own styles and brands. Prototyping can help around this, and asking if the user interface goals have been defined and documented, and referring to them when the user interfaces are being created will definitely help to mitigate that risk. Next one, we have gold plating. So this is the joy of waterfall, where unnecessary functionality is either added in by the business owner, one or more of the stakeholders, or even the developers. And then what can sometimes happen is you have bugs in that area, and even though they weren't asked for, now they become the bane of your life as you have to try and fix them. So to really focus on the MVP, to do requirements scrubbing and prototyping, or even a cost benefit analysis, we'll actually get rid of that. So I'm going to couple this one up with one of the ones that's going to come later on. So for gold plating, when I get it and when I get requirements added in, I always ask, can it be deferred until after go live? So I accept absolutely all of the requirements in, all of the user stories, all of the tasks and the asks. I ask or accept all of those in, but just ask, can it be done at a later point? That mitigates your go live, which means that you can actually do exactly what you promised to do beforehand. Okay, a continuous stream of requirement changes can cause a lot of noise. It's a lot of hassle and will cause a lot of problems on your project. So incremental development here, and also, as I said, deferring changes until later releases or later increments can actually mitigate that risk. Shortfalls in external furnished components. Here, what we're really talking about is the supply chain. So if you're using an external API and that's coming into the system, or if you're using, for logistics, if you're using certain parts, just make sure that that's in place beforehand, that you have inspections, you can do reference checking, compatibility analysis, make sure that if it's a software API, that's exactly as the spec would intend it. Slightly related is the shortfalls in external perform tasks. And here what we're talking about is, and to mitigate this one, is really you're looking to develop the critical path and the critical chain to make sure that all of the dependent tasks on external project developments, maybe it's your client, so it's dependent on them, that is all mitigated well in advance, and that you have that interfaced correctly. So team building and prototyping can help here. So what we're doing here, I know we have two more and I'm going to fly through those, is we're building up a kind of a view on all of these questions that you're going to ask, either as a questionnaire out in an email, which is highly unlikely, or basically as a list of things that you know now that you need to know when you're talking to your business stakeholders. So next one is real-time shortfalls. This one, your business stakeholders probably won't know, but it's going to be written into the contract. This is where your system response times and your SLAs are added in. It's where your additional documentation and manuals are added in, and they define certain criteria. So you want to ask about those beforehand, have it developed into the system, build that quality in. And finally, it's around straining computer science capabilities. It's basically making sure that you're using the right tools to build the functionality. So while a new programming language might be the hot new thing for the developer to do, it might not be proven, it might be bleeding edge, and so it will have, or it might have a problem on your system. It might not, and so a cost benefit analysis would be helpful there. So Having developed your questionnaire, again, thank you for bearing with me on this one, but having developed that, what you want to do is you want to go into an interview. Now, and have interviews with multiple people. Usually they're one-on-one, and one-on-one is best. In an informal setting is actually even better. So usually what I do here is I ask the person to go for coffee, go for a cup of tea, a cup of coffee. You have your very structured, pointed questions listed, so you know exactly what they are, and you can ask leading structured questions which will get you to all of the information that you need. Don't have it like an interrogation, but do it as an informal chat, but listing off all of the points that you know that you need to know in advance, and having maybe some actions taken away if they don't have that SLA, or if they need to get you the contract, or whatever the details are. Now, very important here is what you want to do is you want to note all of the risks that they mention, all of the business drivers that they're saying why they're doing the project, their underlying assumptions and constraints, because what you're going to do is later on you're going to use those as part of this identification project. So just note down everything as we go. Okay, so they're the first two that we'll go into. The questionnaire is useful for the next few slides, but the next one, instead of a one-on-one interview, it is a brainstorming session. Everybody hates these because these are what are usually called a useless meeting, but they can be very, very, very handy when they're structured accordingly. So what you want to do when you do these sessions, regardless of what type or task that you're talking about, is the meeting has to be structured in two different parts. The first part relies on divergent thinking, and this is where you fan out all of the questions. You gather in all of the questions as quickly as possible. No bad answers or no bad statements or no bad risks actually exist. Again, think of the impact versus the probability. So everything could be a possible risk. Get them to fan out or think of as many risks as they possibly can during this half-hour session or 1 hour session, which has all of the different subject matter experts in the room, or as many as you can get. And that is key. Get as many people from different disciplines as you can get. Fan them all out. And then after, don't go down into detail on just one of them. Don't lead it down a certain path, because afterwards what you want to do is you'll go and focus in, and you'll rely on convergent thinking, where you're going to focus in on specific ones and then drill down on those specific risks. Once you do that, the mind closes and it will just go down that path. And that's why you do the divergent thinking beforehand. Brainstorming is really good when it's done in that way, but it has a massive problem either in certain cultures or if there's certain people in the room. And so in order to mitigate that risk, we have a Delphi technique. So Delphi technique is like the brainstorming session, except it's a lot quieter. And the risk or the key here is to have a number of post-it notes or flashcards, to have a big tick marker, and that's very important. What you want to do is you want to have people writing down all of the risks that they identify in silence in as big a tick marker as they possibly can get, so that you can't identify their writing or their handwriting afterwards. And so what happens is that you do the kind of brainstorming session and then you follow in on some of those paths. So it can follow a similar structure, but it's in silence. Nobody says out what their risks or the risks that they've identified are. And that will basically mitigate the hippo in the room, or the highest paid person's opinion. Because in brainstorming sessions, you usually have one or two people who are usually the most senior people are talking most. But what you want to do is you want to elicit the information from absolutely everybody in the room, from the senior developers, the junior developers, the interns, to the QA, absolutely anybody you can, DevOps, all of them. And this makes sure that you don't shut people out if you have that problem. Okay, so those are the two kind of or three ways to gather a lot of information very, very quickly. And at this point, hopefully you have a lot of information. And so now what we're going to do is move on to the next stage in terms of identification. And we're going to move on to the constraints and assumptions analysis. So at the start in the interviews, I said to ask for the project constraints and ask for the project assumptions. On each of the individual requirements and each of the individual user stories, I also ask for the assumptions and constraints to be listed off. And then what we do, and the reason why I want this is because It's like the legs on a chair and you're building it up. What I want to do is I want to remove those and see how solid or stable they are. So what we do is we flip them. We basically invert every single constraint and every single assumption on the project and say that this didn't happen. So if an assumption on the project was that we will have a rate of 2.6% on this payment provider, for example, and the rate, and what we'll do here now is we'll invert that and say it's not 2.6%. So therefore take it to the worst, it's a higher rate. What impact does that have on your project? At what rate does it actually go to before you actually discover that you can't, or the project is not viable? That's the bit that you want to get to. Highly unlikely to happen in those because hopefully the research is being done, but it's definitely worth asking. And in terms of a risk register, in terms of the amount of risks that you can look at and how professional you seem coming into this with your superpowers, it basically gives you a whole set of risks to the project plan, to the risk register for the project plan as quickly and early as possible. So that and what's actually also good is when the developers or when the business analysts are coming up with any requirements or user stories and they're creating all of these assumptions for you, they're all doing the work for you. You literally don't have to think of any single risk at this point. You've gotten all the business drivers and you've gotten all the assumptions and constraints from the senior stakeholders and analysts, and all you have to do is flip them. And now you have a risk register which has probably anything between 20 to 200 risks at this point. Again, don't worry that there's so many because it's all based on the impact. Some of them can just be kind of shoved over to the corner and not looked at. Right, I alluded to it probably wrongly in the last one. Next one to look at is a force field analysis. What you want to do is you want to look at the business drivers behind the project. So this should be in an SOW or it should be in the contract. It should be stated in the blurb of the contract as to, for me it's the blurb, as to why the project is being undertaken. And a lot of people give lip service to this, but this is absolutely vital because it gives an insight into your client, it gives an insight into why the project is taking place. And what you can do again is to invert every single one of those and say the plan was to have to open up in 20 different markets. The plan was to have a 6% growth year on year. And what you'll do is you'll just invert those and see that they don't happen. Later on, we'll go into an analysis of why they might not happen. And so we can further dig down deeper into that risk. Okay, so again, we just list all of these. We have them in our risk register and we have them nice. But the developers at the same time and the business analysts are going along with their development and their estimation at this stage of the project. And so using a 3-point estimation that they're relying on, or PERT analysis, they will come up with the most optimistic, or I asked them to come up with the most optimistic, the most likely, and the most pessimistic estimates, whether it's in user stories or it's in man days or hours or whatever the point might be. And this is of interest to me, not in terms of scheduling, but actually in terms of risk, because there's a distance between these three figures. So let's say the optimistic timeline to implement something was 1 day, the most likely was 2 days, and the most pessimistic was 5 days. Immediately there, what you can see is that we have moved the needle in the middle of this triangle. So this has kind of shifted over to here in terms of over here because it was about 2 days, and the gap in between these 2 points, the most optimistic and the pessimistic, is different. There's not an exact even gap in between them, which means, maybe unknowing to the analyst or the developer, is that they've identified a risk. They've identified a risk because they said that it could take 1 day or 2 days, but in the worst case scenario, it would take 5 days. And the gap in between those 2 days and 5 days is definitely a risk. So this is called standard deviation. And what I do is I basically have a spreadsheet and a flag, and it basically, you can go onto the website, which is associated with this document, but it has all the Excel formulas in there for you. And it basically just raises up a little red flag for me to say, this estimate should have an associated risk. And if it doesn't, then I know that we've already uncovered one. And I go back to the business analyst and I go back to the developer and I ask them for some more risks. And I talk through those. Again, as a project manager, you haven't had to think that much at this point. You just have to either ask questions or you have to kind of go through this process, and you will find a whole pile of risks. The next one is back to college, and that's why the guy is pretending to be awake. But a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or SWOT analysis will actually uncover multiple problems on your project, mainly around the outer edges, and mainly they will find big project problems. So in terms of impact, the ones that you're most likely to find at this point will have a huge impact on your project. Its likelihood to happen might be very small, which would be great, but the impact is going to be massive. And therefore, for that reason, doing a SWOT analysis is easy to do. So there's a lot of obviously templates online for this, but there's a lot of people who've already done them for your industry that you're already in, whether it's pharmaceutical or telecoms or the airline industry. They've all been done. In fact, I went looking for an airline industry SWOT analysis before, and thankfully Michael Porter had done one because he was commissioned to do one. So I could take all of those as a starting point for my risk analysis. Okay, next one is, and this was mentioned earlier on, is that when you identified risks, and so risks have been identified at this point, but you don't know why or you want to know more details about them, a fishbone analysis or a CATWO, which is a type of fishbone analysis, is very, very worthwhile doing. And so what you're looking here is in the brainstorming session, in the second part of the brainstorming session, when you're converging on a particular risk, you're looking at the different factors that would have an impact on the risk itself. So whether it's in the clients, whether it's the information, sorry, the environment that you're working in, the different factors. There's a ton of different types as well that you can go through, whether it's products and people or process. So there's a load of different types. I've just picked CATWO because it has a nice cat with a tie on it. But working through these ones again and kind of storming around or forming around these areas is very, very useful and will actually identify tons of risks for you. Okay. At this point, we're assuming that you're halfway through the analysis stage of the project. Much work mightn't have been done on the project at this point, but you do have risks. And so, as well as a work identification, work breakdown structure, a WBS, you can come up with a risk breakdown structure, or a RBS. And the RBS is very, very interesting, not in what it can actually show, but in what it can or doesn't show. So what I do with this, I have to just explain this first. You write risks in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you use a pivot table on it. And the risk register in the Excel spreadsheet will have different types. So it has the area that you have it, whether it's in quality, in scope, in schedule. So you'll have the different areas, but the key thing here is to also have a level 2 or a subsection on it. So maybe it's in the login screen, if it's in the UI, if it's in the back-end processing, in any of those specific different parts of the system. And what you're looking for is that once you've labeled all of those, you can get this kind of nice picture. Here it's kind of evenly distributed. But we can have this nice picture and we can see where all of our risks are actually identified in these different areas. And then you can have a look at the subsections. If you know that the schedule is the most important risk or the biggest risk that you believe is on the project, but let's just say, I know it has constraints here, but let's just say it's the lower part in here, then you've identified the fact that you have an unknown, that you know that you should have more risks in here, but you haven't actually captured them. And so this allows you to go back in and to the team and say, guys, we must absolutely have more risks in this area. Or if it's in the login screen, and the login screen must be lightning fast and it's within a couple of seconds and it must do all of these tasks, but we don't have risks identified in these areas. Again, you see that the very fact that it doesn't have a large area here, these are all very neat, but it doesn't have a large area here, has identified another risk for you. And I will say that I did this on one of the projects and it had huge different sections here, but there was a schedule. there was one line just at the very, very end, effectively around about here, and this one line killed the whole project. And so that's why it's important to note that what you're looking for is, you're not looking at the size of the risk and the magnitude, but this is just showing you the amount of risks that you've found on the project. So that one tiny little line down the end of the project was the one that killed my project. And so don't look at them just on that. They don't show you impact and probability. They just show you the areas, but they're very useful for showing you those areas and making sure that you have captured everything that you need. Okay, next, so this is kind of, we'll keep on doing these practices throughout the project. And near the end of the project, if you have all of these features developed, and you either are looking for risks or you've identified a risk, but you want to step through it because you can't find the root cause and the fishbone diagram is not giving you the answers, you can do a failure mode and an effects analysis. So within this failure mode and effects analysis, effectively it's done in 3 different parts. You can see in the stamp, the yellow section here is where you list the feature or function, and then you go through all of the different possible causes and issues with it. Then you do steps to improve it, and you have a look at it afterwards. But this is a very weighty process. I normally don't do it. I've done it once just for the exercise. It is big and beefy. It will take a long time, and it doesn't yield the kind of return on investment or the impact that you might want. So only use it when you really need to and when you're really stuck. It's methodical, it is a process, and it will cause you to find the answers that you're looking for. Okay, and then finally, in this area, it is the cyclomatic complexity that we're going to look at. There are tools and processes out here for this, but basically what you're looking for within this section is you're looking for the independent paths through the system. So here on the left-hand side, we can see that we go from, let's say, whether this is a function, a routine, or a module, we go from this, we go from this module all the way back up here, and there can be little loops down to the end. But in this, on the right-hand side, the cyclomatic complexity will show you that it can go all the way there and back again to the very, very start. That in itself is an independent routine or an independent path, and that actually in itself could be an infinite loop that you've just identified. Don't walk through this yourself. There are definitely tools that will do this. They do cost a lot of money, but you can get free versions of them to kind of go down 5,000 lines of code or to a certain level, a certain child level, and that can be handy. So just when they're in there, make it known that you can actually look through this, so you can kind of get an eyeball or a view into the code itself without having to ever look at the code and without having gone through any of the processes. Okay, having seen all of the other risks and having identified them, you could actually still have residuals or secondary risks on this. So forgive me here, I'm going to give 2 really bad examples for you. 2 bad examples, and those bad examples are in the area of, let's say you want to escape the world and you go and buy a log cabin in Canada, but you hear that there's bears in that area. Okay, so in order to mitigate the risk of a bear coming to your log cabin, you put out a bear trap. But then you hear a noise at nighttime. And so having mitigated this risk of a bear, you hear a noise at nighttime, you go out and investigate, and you get trapped in the bear trap. So that's a secondary risk that you've just triggered. And as you can guess, the secondary risk could be even worse than the first risk. Or what happens is that you have another animal has come and triggered that trap. And then the residual risk is that more animals come attracted by the fact that this animal has been caught. So it's a common technique. I know it's a bit crass, but it's a common kind of anecdote to give with residual and secondary risks, that sometimes they can be worse than the first ones. So after you find the main risk, maybe have a look at all of the rest and see. But with COVID-19, the reason why I suppose we're doing a webinar rather than a face-to-face session, when the coronavirus started up, I looked at this, and you could see that because it was going to go on for a long time, and because people were being asked to stay indoors and not go to work, then there was going to be a secondary risk where the supply chain was going to start to be affected, that people couldn't actually make the products. And so there's fallout risks from all of those, and the residual risks is we also don't get to see or don't get to go out and meet people. So they're the ones. These are ones that I use. As you can probably see, I don't do many of them. I basically figure out the questionnaire, figure out the risks that might actually happen on the project, and let everybody else kind of take care of them all. And then I just look to collate them all myself and have a risk register, which I then mitigate. So I don't have to have this expertise in the project. Somebody else does, and somebody else help in that. So next in this, what I just want to do is a quick recap, because we have 15 minutes left. I want to do a quick recap as you're finishing off your lunch. So we've collected all of the different parts. We brought it all together. I just want to remind you in terms of what we've gone through is that we found that 56% of all of the problems on the project that we're going to face are most likely going to come from the processes that are inherent in projects, while 44% will come from the people. So we found a number of techniques to mitigate those, or to identify them, and then we can use those to mitigate the risks afterwards. So the risks there are the interview, the questionnaire, as we said, then going through the brainstorming or Delphi techniques, having a look at the constraints and assumption analysis, force field analysis, then getting the developers to do the 3-point estimation, and then you figuring out risks from that, going through a SWOT analysis with the business stakeholders, cause and effect diagrams to help with some of the previous ones, the failure mode and effects analysis, having a look at the risks and identifying the gaps in there, having a look at the code in terms of cyclomatic complexity, and then looking at all of those risks that you have, assuming that they're going to have a secondary or a residual risk, and trying to figure out what they are, and figuring out if they're actually worse than the original risk, so that you need to accept the first risk because the second risk is so bad. And then just to go back in, of all of those techniques that you're going to go through, what you're probably going to find, as I said, is a lack of management commitment, a misunderstanding of requirements, lack of user involvement, changes to those requirements, failure to gain user commitment, a failure to manage end user expectations, and a lack of effective project management methodology. So you've heard enough of my voice. So what I'm going to do is, I really am interested to see if this has touched home with you, and if there's any questions or queries that you might have on this, and see if there's any technique which you found which could be useful here that you could use at a later point on an upcoming project. So I'm going to hand this back then to Katrina. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm just trying to thank you very much, David. Like it's interesting for me just to see how many of those techniques are there. Some are definitely very familiar to me, and I'm probably using the same ones over and over again. So one of the questions here, if you guys can pop back into menti.com, one of the questions we had was having seen all of this, I'm not sure why, having seen all of this, which ones would you be most likely to use? I'm particularly interested in maybe one that you haven't used before, or maybe you've forgotten about, just to give you the opportunity there. So that flashes up on the screen all of the various techniques that that David has gone through. Gosh, I'm not sure what I did there, guys, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay, well that's I think some of the ones, David, that you maybe get your input on this, do you think that there's any industry specific ones maybe that are used more by certain industries? Like, is there ones that would be typically used in software development over maybe a manufacturing project? Have you come across anything in that area?
So definitely, I think the 3-point estimation or the PERT analysis, while it's applicable for other projects and industries, is mainly just a software tool, but it can be very, very handy to use, definitely in there. And I do like one of my easiest ones. I know it only has 2 in there, but it is the constraints and assumptions analysis. It's almost like getting people more skilled than myself to answer or to come up with all of the risks, but without knowing that they actually identified any risks in there. Yeah. We see here that there's 12 interviews listed. Again, they can be formal and informal, and it's not just with one person, but it should be multiple times. It's a good excuse to go for coffee quite a lot.
It is. I thought that the Delphi technique was good, particularly when you're calling out the hippo in the room, which I'd never come across before. So when I saw it originally, I thought you meant an elephant. But that's quite interesting, because that is something that can happen, particularly in lessons learned reviews. So like, I would often use the nominal group technique for that reason, just to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and not just the, because some people are talkative as well. But guys, I mean, that's interesting. Nearly everybody, we've a few more people left to vote there, but like it's quite interesting that it is leaning still heavily towards the very interactive ones, the interview, the brainstorming, and the Delphi technique, where like you really are getting people in a room and you're getting them around a set of questions and a flip chart. So we're obviously, we like to talk, I would say. I think we've got some questions here, so we'll just one was actually, it's a very interesting question. Just Jackie has asked this, or made the statement, is that the Delphi technique is interesting, but we'd be interested to see how this would work in a virtual environment. And that's definitely food for thought in the situation that we're in at the moment. So I suppose, David, interview works very well right now in the virtual technique, but have you tried yourself at the moment any of these in a virtual environment?
So there's a website called boards.com, which allows you to do a lessons learned session, but it's completely anonymous. So it's different to Jira, it's different to Trello, where you can see who logged something, or even Google. It's completely anonymous, and you can vote for it. So I think it's boards.com is a really, really handy tool to allow for anything to be said. The only thing I'll say is that if somebody really wants to figure out who said it, they kind of watch the grammar and the language. So just say it as generic as possible, because really you do want to elicit that, and say it beforehand. Try and use as minimal words as possible. But we are just looking for risks. We're not looking to point fingers.
We do get clever like that as project managers. We've one more point here from Jose, and actually this is a great point. I love this. And again, everyone, you can ask questions. We've got a couple of minutes here to ask questions, but Jose, I love this question. I'm wondering how specifically you guys have been dealing with positive risks or opportunities. It's a very good reminder that the risk process is about opportunities as well as risks. So in your opinion, David, would any of these suit the looking at the opportunity side of the risk analysis?
So it is brilliant, and I had it written down that I was meant to mention it, that there's a risk and there's an opportunity, and depending on which way you approach it, you can turn the risk into an opportunity. So absolutely, the brainstorming sessions are fantastic for that. The Delphi techniques can be, and even Delphi techniques using then a brainstorming session afterwards. I mean, there's so many companies have been started up off the back of these types of questions and these types of risks being identified, or opportunities being identified, but them being too small for the large organizations to go after, and then they make tons of money. I mean, I know there was one Googler, for example, who left Google for this, went and created his own company off the back of one of the sessions, possibly which happened at a pub, I'm not sure, but happened around that time, and then that got sold back to Google for at least over 10 million. Just based on the fact that a risk had been identified, which had a market need, or basically people had a need for it, and he was able to address that. So yeah, the interviews and brainstorming sessions are brilliant for it, and to further go down the road with the fishbone analysis.
Yeah, that's very good. Actually, I would point out one thing though as well, that the project itself is usually the biggest opportunity. So it is, a lot of the risks are born out of it, but the reason that we're implementing the project in the first place is because there's an opportunity that we see, whether it's to make money, save money, there's always a reason there. Thomas has asked, or it's probably more of a statement here, it just, for the times that we're in right now, risk identification techniques may become more relevant for companies having to rethink their strategies and business models given the current COVID-19 impacts.
You know, that, so absolutely, and that almost consumes me when I read some of the news at this point. What is very useful there is the scenario planning techniques to you kind of envision what the world is going to be like in 6 months' time. What are people going to need? What are the risks that they're going to be facing? How can you mitigate those risks for them? So absolutely, I mean, it's a sad thing that it's such a rife time for risk mitigation and analysis and opportunity. And I see, was it Dyson, James Dyson over the weekend, so I heard, had a look. So there's a big need for ventilators. He had a look and invented a new type of ventilator, which is easy to mass produce. He invented it within 10 days, and now his company has sold, I think it's 10,000 to the NHS. This morning it was in the news. So there's a lot of risks, but there's a lot of time that we, you know, problems to be solved around this also.
Certainly a lot of opportunities there. Okay, guys, we're coming up to 5 minutes to the hour here. I'll just, if there's an opportunity now for any more questions, we'll give it a minute, and I'll just maybe explain to you what's going to happen next. So first of all, thank you all for joining us, because it is our first webinar. You'll see it in the email that you received to register. I would appreciate people's feedback on this webinar itself, how it was run. Maybe if you've any experts on the call, please give us some advice. I would love to hear it. We're trialing the software that we're using at the moment. The intention is here we are recording, so I intend to share the recording and also the results of the Mentimeter poll as well as the slide deck that David has gone through on the call as well. So they will all, a couple of things will happen with those. They will be up on the PMI events chapter page. I'll just see if I can share my screen again with you. So we have David. First of all, thank you very much for joining us and being the presenter on our first webinar. So we really appreciate it. It's definitely a very technical topic, and I think it's an important time. And as Thomas said, it might be an even more important time now given the current situation. We're going to be setting up some more webinars, so if you keep an eye out on the PMI Ireland chapter webpage, you'll see we will have a number scheduled. So I've got another one planned for April, and there are actually two more planned for April and 2 more planned for May, and one of them which is on project managers and managing digital transformations, and the next one will be about what is program management. So looking to maybe get 2 a month in to keep us going in terms of the knowledge base and the PDUs that we all need for our certifications. So on that note, the screen in front of you will see, for all of you that are members of the PMI, you also have access to projectmanagement.com. Please do use it. In here, and you'll see a little clip here that I put up, there are a lot of webinars ongoing, and you'll also have access to recordings of webinars as well. And it's all a way for you to keep up to date with the latest of what's going on in project management, and also, as I said, to gain PDUs. For everyone that's on the call, we will auto register you for your PDU, and so that you'll probably get the email just letting you know that that's happened. You need to register and attend also, and we'll auto register it for you. If you need to listen to it back, you can self-claim the PDU at a later time. Okay, everybody, so thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the input, and we will be talking to you in a couple of weeks on our next webinar. Thank you very much.